and welcome to the Zero Ends channel. Please like and subscribe. Please enjoy our live.
Okay. So before I begin, for those that will listen, please, share this recording to young boys and girls. I think this is a historical lesson that they'll know and appreciate it because, like always, when we talk about African American in history, and not only Black people, but just Black people in general history, we play a major role in the development and the change of society. And a lot of young people don't really appreciate the work that's being put and done that shapes their reality to what they see today. They feel that as they get older, that they feel they have no purpose in the world or any value because the society teaches self-defeating and self-hatred. And I'm telling you right now that your ancestors that fought and bled so you could have and roam free and to have the liberties you have today, they commit what is called the greatest sacrifice. And I want people to, of all age, to appreciate the sacrifice your ancestors made for your comfort today. Okay, we could start so turn to the page. Okay. And this is the conclusion part of chapter 12, section 2. So listen good. Okay. All right, let's go. Excitement in Eastern North Carolina was as widespread and intense as in Virginia. Indeed, it was so great that it led to the death of 3 white men due to heart failure. Typically, the letter from this area told of the mobilization of the manpower, the need for more arms, the arrest of dozens of slaves, and the lashing of hanging of many. One from Murfreesboro, dated August the 31st, told of the arrest of 5 slaves, 2 of whom, London G. and Sam Bertley, were supposed to be Baptist preachers. A show of force was still needed to convince the Negroes that revolts was hopeless. Religion has been brought to their aid. Their leaders, who are preachers, have convinced many of them that to die in the cause in which they are engaged afford them a passport to leave, or actually to heaven. Many have said so when about to die. Another letter that dates Sampson County, September 13th, addressed to the governor and signed by William Blanks and 4 other citizens, and it reads, end quote, "Sir, the inhabitants of Simpson have been alarmed with an insurrection of the Negroes. We have 10 or 15 Negroes in jail, and we have such profile that most of them will be bound over to our superior courts. We have testimony that will implicate most of the Negroes in the county. The people of Dauphin County has examined 10 or 15 Negroes and found 2 guilty and have you put them to death. There never was such excitement in Sampson and Dauphin before." A letter communicating from Hyde County contains more graphic detail. The governor is informed that the colonel has obeyed orders and has commanded the guard to travel all nights long to whip all slaves which they catch off these owners. The plantation without a pass from his or her owner will give you a state of the alarm. First, there was a store broken open at 5 to 6 bags, shot, and powder. Second, there has been found in possession of slave guns and ammunition. Third, there has been many threats by the slaves, which has been, and one word, illegibly. Fourthly, we have had 2 slaves preachers tried by a single magistrate, and the evidence against one was that he went to one Mr. Gibbs and asked him if he would join them for their whereabout to rise. And this letter ended with a plea to the governor, who is addressing as Young Majesty, or Your Majesty. To forward arms to the county, a company of artillery of the United States Army was dispatched to Newburgh early in September. Martial law was declared in Wrigley, and the panic exaggerate reports. Arrests, beating, executions, and lynchings lasted well into November of 1831. Now, mind you, when we talk about martial, we're not talking about the one that's recent in present day, but we're talking about back then, before the Civil War enacted, back in the mid 1800s, around 1860 or late 1859, when the Civil War started to begin. I think it began in the 60s, though, 1860s, I believe. But moving on. Missed in the later 50s, record is conversation with 2 poor whites of Mississippi, almost certainly referring to these sterling days. When I used to live in Alabama, I remember when I was a boy, Mrs. had been about 20 years ago, folks was dreadful, frightened about the Negroes. I remember they built press in the wood where they could hide, and Christmas time they went and got into the pens, fretting the Negroes or the niggers was raising. I remember the same time where we was in South Carolina and said his wife, we had all our things put in a bag so we could tote them if we heard they was coming our way. 4 were expressed in October 1831 of a revolt of the slave assisting by Indians in Alabama. It was reported that the infections is pretty general with the Negroes, many of whom were arrested. In Lawrence County, South Carolina, at least 2 slaves were executed for plotting rebellions at this time. Some hinted of what was occurring in Mississippi and providing by the facts that a runaway slave in that state in 1839 declared that his scars were caused from severe whippings with a cow skin at the time of the Southampton insurrections. If y'all remember, that was insurrections back in history. The messenger of Mecca, Georgia, apologized for the barrenness of the present papers and offered as an excuse of the fact that its staff was on patrol duty. In October 1831, 6 slaves were arrested on a charge of conspiracy in Dublin, Georgia, or Dublin, Georgia, of whom 4 were executed the same month. Arms were distributed to the citizens of Milledgeville, and 4 slaves of that city were arrested, but after examination, release troubles was also reported from Jones County and the state, but details are unknown. A conspiracy was at the end of the year reporting from Fafaletta or Fayette Valley, Tennessee. The objective of the slave was to set fire to some buildings and, amidst the confusion of the citizens, to seize as many guns and implement of destruction as they could procure and commence a general massacre. Many of those who were engaged in this infidel conspiracy have been slashing with all this severity, which the antiquity of their diabolical schemes are justified and deserve. No specific instance of outbreak among Louisiana slaves directly after the Turner rebellions has been seen through reference to their insurrectionary deposition, and the special precaution therefore taken by the federal government has already been made. A resident of the state wrote a revealing letter to a friend, a congressman, after the Turner events. Though federal reinforcement had already been forwarded to his state, he was apparently unaware of this. He wrote, and he wrote, "The late occurrence in Virginia has awakened a deep solicitude here as the perils of our own situation. You will have seen from the papers from our governor, A.B. Roman, has called the legislature for the 14th of next month. It is understood that the principal objective is making this call is the expectations that some steps may be taken for the safety of the state. We do nothing worth doing without some help. So many have an interest in the preservation of the county, as well as ourselves, that we have every possible claim or all the aids that can be given." He went on a suggestion that an effective police force would be 2 steamboats filled with well-armed federal troops, regular plying between New Orleans and St. Franceville. No one at all acquainted with the county or the country can doubt that there would be great security in such a force against any rising happening, or if it occurs, that they would then provide or prove most efficient arms of defense. Let me ask you to make such inquiries as well and enable you to inform me how far we might count on the co-operations of the federal government. In this of any other schemes, a somewhat similar suggestion comprised unannounced tour by from 10 to 15 companies of infantry, artillery, or riflemen was made to govern Roman by the commanding officer of the Western Army of the United States. The basic ideal represents by the communications at stuffing and sharpening once more of the apparatus of suppression and terrorism was instituted. Following these outbreaks and plots of 1831 in cities, states, and territories, this took in the main 3 forms: repression of the free Negro, repression of the slave, and attempts at the amelioration of the social unrest resulting essential in greater efforts at African colonization and in repression of anti-slavery options and though in the South. To exemplify the flood of legislation, two states, Maryland and Virginia, will be examined in detail. The General Assemblies of Maryland, meaning from December 1831 to March 1832, enacts the following pretense laws. The immigration of free Negroes was forbidden. Interesting. Any who did enter were not to be given employment, and if remained over 10 days were to pay fines and $50 per week. No free Negro was to possess any weapon. Slave and free Negro were permitted to hold religious service only if whites were present. No foodstuff, tobacco, or spirituous liquor were to be bought from any Negro, nor were the later to be sold to a Negro. The importations of slaves for sale after June 1st, 1832 was forbidden. The Maryland State Colonization Society was incorporated and a board of managers of three-person was to be appointed by the governor and council. This board was to spread propaganda detailing an alleged doubtful of liberal and to remove free Negroes from the state. $20,000 were given for 1831 and permission to subsequently borrow up to $200,000. The last sum was not appropriated. It is not enough Negroes volunteers to leave to use up the available, and there's a subscript on the bottom which you can read for yourself. Availability money force was to be used. Moreover, the congressmen from Maryland were memorized to do what they could to obtain a grant from the federal government for colonization. The purpose, and if they deem this unconstitutional, work for a constitutional amendment making the act possible for recent occurrence in this state as well as other states of our union have impressed more deeply upon our mind the necessities of division or devising some means by which we may facilitate the removal of the free person of color from our state. Interesting. Though, as has been shown, Virginia passed many restrictive measures in the years immediately preceding Turner's revolt. Her assembly but find it possible to enact new regulations in the 1831 through 1832 meeting. It was then provided that no slave, free Negro, or mulatto were he shall have been ordained or licensed or otherwise shall hereafter undertake to preach, exhort, or conduct or hold any assemblies or meetings for religious or other purpose, either in the daytime or at night, under a penalty of not over 39 lashes. We're going to pause right there for a second. Matter of fact, let me read that again for y'all so y'all could get clearance. Where's my pen? I'm going to highlight that too. And this is a ruling and a regulation. And it says here, the new regulation of 1831 for 1832 meeting, and it says, and it provides that no slave, free Negro, or mulatto, or whether he shall have been ordained or licensed or otherwise shall hereafter undertake to preach, exhort, or conduct or hold any assemblies or meetings for religious or other purposes, either in the daytime or at night, and sit under a penalty of not over 39 lashes. So, seems to me, because of the revolts during those first 2 years and a little bit further, they deemed the people that were pastors of that time, not now, because pastors now are more pacified more than ever for the last century, and I would say almost the last 190 years now, because we're in a new decade now, that it was forbidden. And it's not because they were teaching the Bible that their slave master engraved on it, because remember, this Christianity that people do not know from the black man and woman today, either here in America or abroad, this was a forced religion. And the purpose of it is to make you more of a slave, docile to your master, to your God, your white God, the Euro God. No, there was no such thing as no black God or black Jesus. So X that out your mind for anybody that goes and understand this reading. And the purpose why they put penalties in that, because when Negroes at the time, when they come to a circle to feel like they were going to preach the word of God, pushing that same nonsense, they will sit there plot how they're going to be liberated and free from their oppression and from their slave masters. So like anything, they put a law in effect, and if they find that there's any congregation, most likely all slaves that got whipped 30 lashes to instill fear of them trying to come together to revolt and fight for their freedom. So that's something to really catch on and have a clear understanding. Well, let's continue. Under penalty of not over 39 lashes, whites, however, were allowed to take Negroes to their own service, and a licensed white preacher was permitted to address Negroes during the daytime. No free Negro was to possess weapons. If any Negro should commit assault on white person with intent to kill, death without benefits of clergy was to be his punishment. No one was to sell liquor to purchase it from a slave, and no Negro was to sell liquor within 1 mile of a public assembly. An act which went into operation July the 1st, 1832, and provided that any Negro attended a sedition meeting or saying anything of such a nature was to be whipped not over 39 times, while a white person so guilty was to be fined from $100 to $1,000. Another act passed March the 5th, 1832. Though as the influential editors Thomas Ritchie remarks, applicable to one county only was to deem sufficiently important as effective the general policy of the state to be inserted among the acts of public nature. This provides that the $15,000 pledge for the case of colonization at the mass meeting in Northampton was to become part of the public debt of that county. But what this legislator did not do, and why, and what various citizens inside and outside the horrible body thought it ought to do, and what was said to and in and report and about and ask of this body are of greater sufficiency than the laws it passed. In the 20s, with the prevailing depression, the acute fear of Negroes, and the frequent manifestation of slave unrest, there had developed in the South, as has been indicated, a growing perplexity and doubt concerning the wisdom of slavery. Prior to the Turner rebellions, this had been on the whole expressed in a hushed sort of way. Thus, Thomas Ritchie, who at least formerly was prior to 1832, an anti-slavery urged Western Virginians at the Constitutional Convention of 1829 through 1830 to avoid emancipation alternance. There's a subtitle in here. The Turner Cataclysm, however, succeeded in ripping up for 1 year the lead of censorship applied by the slaveocracy. This is especially true of the state most directly affected by that event. And the question of slavery was publicized, debated for weeks in Virginia. Legislators during the 1832 session, the Western representative grieved at their section inferior political positions as compared with the East and restrained by no considerable body of slave holdings. Consentings use anti-slavery utterance and sentiments which were here expressed as deeply as fully as they were ever to be in Ohio and Massachusetts, as a weapon in their sectional battles. The extent of power of this anti-slavery influence has been greatly exaggerated, and it has been declared that slavery abolished came within a very few votes of accomplishment. In Virginia at that time, many writers under this illusion ascribed the failure only to annoyance and the fear caused by the agitations of the northern abolitionists, who are dragged to explain everything. Thus, the Turner Revolts was a result of their nefarious activities, or nefarious activities. Though the vehemence of the anti-slavery pronouncements in the Virginia legislature followed that event in explaining by the fact that abolitionist propagandists had not yet really begun. The defeat of any emancipation measures is properly blamed upon resentment and northern interference. The sensitive slaveholders, one is asked to believe, although actually desiring to relinquish their property, refused to do so in order to spite the many abolitionists. But there is no evidence to show a connection between Turner's efforts of those of the abolitionists, and it is not true that the Virginia legislature follows his rebellion came close to abolishing this session came close to passing a colonization bill introduced by W.H. Broadux of Dinwiddie, a Piedmont county, modeled on the already passed by Maryland, and it next year did appreciate $18,000 for such a purpose, but to identify this with the abolition of slavery, as does, for example, Edward Channing, is enormous, and it is to be noted that Bordock's bill passed the Eastern Control House of Delegates, but because no provision was made in it for those Negroes who might be emancipated without sufficient funds for transportation, it was defeated in the Senate by Western oppositions. I think this is a small subtitle here, which y'all can read for yourself. The only anti-slavery activity outside the talks and the recipients of petitions developed when a Mr. Witcher moved that consideration of the slavery question by indefinitely postponed. This was voted down 71 to 60, and therefore a committee of slaves, free Negroes, and the recent insurrection was appointed. This committee, in the person of its chairman, Mr. Goody, and Beckelberg, resolved that it is not expedient to legislate on the questions of emancipation and asked to be absolved from further consideration of that subject. Two amendments as to what the committee ought to consider were offered. Mr. Parson suggests it was expended for it to be considered the problem. This was defeated by the vote of 73 to 58. Mr. Thomas J. Randolph then offers an elaborate plan for gradual emancipation, which he thought the committee would do well to ponder. This seemed never to have come to a vote. Nothing was done. It was also be pointed out that while it is true the legislative hall and newspapers were filled with very nearly all the arguments against slavery that were ever to be used, it is far off the mark to say, for example, the Richmond Inquiry urged that slavery be abolished, or that Ritchie editor favored the abolition of Negro slaves in 1832. True that, the paper shouts something must be done. But what concretely, what did it suggest? In fine, by great discretion, the utmost respect for providing property or private property, great preservance by an active and increased police, we may rid ourselves of some long undistant time of evil which he left itself will grow with our growth and strengthen with our strength. That is high points of emancipation, feeling of the influential papers, and it is difficult to ascertain whether the writer is deploring slavery or asking that too rapid growth by check. Okay. And while anti-slavery letters abound in the press, pro-slavery letters were certainly not rare, but now being considered vulgar, they are often overlooked by commentaries and evaluating anti-killing Southern opinions. One signed a slaveholder and no politician declared. Some people seem very anxious to devise some scheme for the gradual emancipation of our slave. If they know what was good for themselves, they had better let the question rest, for as I live for one, they will have to take them at the point of bayonetta. I do not mean to go into discussion of the subject, but merely to state that public sentiment is against any scheme of emancipation. A letter from Richmond Hugh told the decision of neighbors one Cunningly to free his slave and hire white men. And I think the letter will state here, and as read, they'll be cheaper he said, and he can make more money on his plantation than he does now. Connell said, I'm the white laborer, must be better fed and clothed and lodged than your Negroes, and you'll have to pay them wages too. How can you make more money then? But the Negro children said, the white man, will have their children too, said I, and if you think they can work harder than the blacks, I reckon you'll be out, for no people will work more or ought to work more than our Negroes. Do they'll do their work well too? If the master or overseer be good for anything, but this last I didn't say to him. As a final example, there is a blunt letter from ABC of Halifax City, and it quotes here. This one thing we wish to be understood and remembered, that the Constitution of this state has been Tom, Dick, and Harry. Property has been made Polly, Nancy, Molly property, and he the property, an evil, a curse, or what not. We intend to hold it. Property which is considered the most valuable by the owner of it. It is the nice thing, and for the right there to be called in question by an unphilosophical set of political mount banking under that of influence of supernatural agencies, or decent is insufficient. And in 1832, there appears in rapid to the allegations of Western Virginia a classic pro-slavery paper that by Thomas R. Dewey, using historical anthropology and theological arguments that had already been generally accepted in the lower South and denied the possibility of visibility of solving the slavery problem by colonization. He gave to many former anti-slaveries like Thomas Ritchie, James Paulding, Joseph Gales, and Edmund Ruffin rationalization for affirmation of slavery to be pre-CA good. Do not fail to notice the immediate interest of the slaveholders for the remarkable, wonderful, and relating Virginia slaves are now higher than they have been for many years in the past. Returning prosperity was indeed the clinching pro-slavery argument. By 1830, slave prices had begun to rise from their low of 400 and had reached at the end of the year about 425 for a prime field hand. In 1831, 460 was the average, and by 1832, the price hit 500. A rise of 25% in 3 years. It kept going up until it reached 1,100 in 1837. This rise in prices due to the increased demand for slaves in the southwestern states and improved methods of agriculture agriculture and better means of intercommunication and the employment given Negro slaves upon work of internal improvement and the factories received an economic interest in Negro slaves. In Eastern Virginia and in the Old South generally, the Southern rulers reinsured and gained vigor, reinstituted their strict censorship of anti-slavery opinions and resettlements at Northern interference as being more chivalrous was the reason alleged in public debates and newspapers paragraphs and for these policies. The era of crisis taken from remaining groups of anti-slavery people at Quakers lead to alter their sentiment. Emancipation societies disappear in the South and spring up by the hundreds in the North. Anti-slavery agitators, in any shape or under any pretext, are furious fanatics and crave or hypocrites, and we hereby promise them upon all occasions which may put them in our power the fate of private and the incendiary and the midnight assassins. While in the North, there began to develop the feeling that all who are not with the abolitionists are against them, for silence and inactions are public acquaintance in things as they are. And the decades of the 20s was a period of growth for the colonization movement, which was further accelerated by the Turner Revolts. Some who become interested in the probably felt sincerely that it might end slavery, but on the whole, the purpose was to strengthen slavery by removing dangerous elements among the Negroes, keep the growth of the free Negro population down, and confusion and the anti-slavery movement. The attitude or the altitude of exemplified in the letter from Dr. John Keir, a leader in the movement in Mississippi. He admitted that colonization might lead to some manumission, but felt sure these would be made only by indulgent masters. This, he argued, would be desirable. And this is what he said, unquote. Will it not benefit other slaveholders rather by removing some examples of loose and injurious, indulgent discipline and effects of mistaken feelings of humanity? Will it not have the effects also of enhancing the value of these or those who may be left? Will not the hand of slavery be strengthened as those who shall remain exempt from the only grounds of hope to the slave of voluntary acts of his master? But this concept of colonization was not an appearance seriously held by many people, particularly after Dew demonstrate the extreme difficulties, indeed impossibilities, as he thought of accomplishing it. An argument that appears to John Quincy Adams, as to most others, to be conclusive. Another and decision factor in the decline of the colonization movement was the almost unanimous opposition of the Negroes, who felt America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears. It is to be observed that the collapse here mentioned, which sets in about 1836 and was permanently referred to the movement from the colonization of free Negroes, not of free Negroes, which was the development later and still leaves through feebly. Following the Turner uprising, there was some explosions of free Negroes, and for a time it was feared too that a mass exodus of non-slaveholders, whites, in addition to the Quakers, might occur, but this did not develop. The same events, by precipitating a vehement discussion of the slavery questions and by bringing to the foreground one of the precedent's dangers, stimulated the feeling of secularism or sectarism in Virginia, suggestions for the splitting of the states recurring, but a much greater upheaval than one begun by the slaying of Southampton was needed to accomplish that. This decade of great slave unrest, which culminated in the outbreaks of conspiracies of 1831 and which result in a strengthening of the machinery of repression, was followed by the 3 years of surface claims so far as rebellion, and plots were concerned as apparently unimportant exceptions. Occurs in the summer of 1833 in Fairfax, Virginia, where fear arose by the suspicion characterized a white carpenter named John Windorf, who was thought to be provoking a servile insurrection. Some 9 of 10 slaves were arrested, but their deposition is unknown. Available evidence, which is slightly indicated that this affair was a minor proportion. And that's the end of chapter 12, section 2. And to recap, going back a few pages back, as you know, the slaves there was an increase in price in slaves during the 1830s. And if we can go back from later 1830s, it looked like the price of slaves were under $400. And it started to grow because of demand. And everybody knows that there was with demand, there's going to be inflation depending on the market. But overall, as you know, Nat Turner's part in history was very pivotal in regards to the slowly abolishment of slavery. And not just him alone, but there were many outbreaks, many slave revolts, many deaths that played, even that led to Nat Turner's insurrection back in the early 30s. So as you know, the enemy, like anything, had to put more restrictions, provisions, and watch of the free Negroes and the slaves. And it came to a point where, as y'all know, there were talks of trying to abolish slavery. And not because they had a change of heart. They really had to start abolishing because the fear of they could be possibly killed by their slaves. And most of their slaves were influenced by free Negroes. Now, the free Negro part, I think it's a book that devotes solely on blacks that they said that are in the soil we call America Ready. But you gotta do further research and find books on the history on that piece. This book right here only talks about just the slave revolts and the roles of the ones that were oppressed and enslaved to the ones that weren't. That led to many revolts in America. So, like always, I appreciate y'all that are listening to the stream. This wraps up this chapter. The next chapter will be chapter 13. Be on the lookout. Other than that, thank you for listening. Until next time, take care.